We have also undertaken 20 in-depth policy review on social economy and social entrepreneurship, helping construct national and regional strategy for social economy and innovation. Most recently, with the help of our local development forum partner, the Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training, we have released the Japanese translation of our council recommendation on the social and solidarity economy that will be shared in the chat right now. On that note, we welcome governments and policymakers, including our friends in Japan, to join forces to build together a vibrant and robust social economy. A critical component and a stakeholder of our work on social economy is cooperative. We have done significant work in this field, from zooming in on how cooperatives can contribute to the transition from informal to formal jobs in Colombia, to spotlighting innovations that occur from platform cooperative, and we are here to engage and do more together with you. And this is why we have organized this meaningful event with our partner, the Japanese Institute for Labor Policy and Training, whom I warmly thank for hosting this webinar. Today, we have also the privilege of learning from an impressive group of speakers who are national and international experts on worker cooperatives. On behalf of the OECD, I would like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of them. Mr. Jean-Louis Bancel from France, Ms. Amaya Delgado from Spain, Ms. Diana Dovkan from Sicopa, Mr. John Atherton from United Kingdom, Mr. Yoshio Mizuno from Japan, and Mr. Yoon-sik Eum from South Korea and the International Cooperative Alliance. As you can see here today are represented National Confederation of Worker Cooperatives, regional and international alliances, and a ministry. And these attest, of course, the diversity and richness of this panel. To conclude, I wish everyone a productive discussion, and I would like now to invite Ms. Ono, Executive Director of the GLPT, and Mr. Takeuchi, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, to deliver their opening remark. Ms. Ono, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
皆様、こんばんは。労働政策研究研修機構 GLPT の理事の小野明子でございます。パリは午前中ですね。おはようございます。本日は日本はもとより世界の各地から大勢の方々にご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。開催にあたってご尽力いただきました竹内事務次長ほか OECD の皆様には感謝申し上げます。また本日ご出席の講演者の皆様にも労働政策研究研修機構と OECD を代表して厚く御礼申し上げます。本日の国際セミナーは、労働政策研究研修機構が長年にわたってメンバーとなっている OECD のローカルエコノミック&エンプロイメント・ディベロップメント・プログラム、リードプログラムの方々との話し合いの中で、何か共通のテーマでできることはないか模索する中で実現した企画となっております。後ほど厚生労働省の水野市長が詳しくご説明されると思いますが、日本では2022年10月に労働者協同組合法が施行されました。これまで NPO 法人や企業組合など様々な法人格によって共同労働を理念とする組織が存在しておりましたが、法律の施行により労働者協同組合として法人格を取得できるようになりました。多様な就業機会の創出とともに、 地域の課題に応じた事業を促進することが期待されております。私も現在、GILPT の中で労働者協同組合の可能性について研究を進めております。本国際セミナーでは共同労働についての理解を深め、将来への道筋を描く一助とするため、国際的な実務家、専門家から長い歴史と伝統の中で日本よりも存在感の多い欧州の、世界の協同組合の特徴や、活動事例をお聞きすることになっております。本日は労働者協同組合で活動されている方々もたくさん参加されていると伺っております。私自身もとても楽しみにしておりましたし、本日のセミナーの講演や議論が労働者協同組合の活動の発展につながるなど、実りの多い成果を得られることを記念し、私のご挨拶とさせていただきます。ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Ms. Ono. And I now pass the floor to our Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Takeuchi. Mr. Takeuchi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonella. Dear Ms. Ono, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to join you for today's Local Development Forum seminar on promoting and supporting worker cooperatives. Why worker cooperatives? Because they not only create sustainable jobs, but can also help solve some of the most pressing social or environmental challenges. Two examples. In digital and green transition is one. Labor integration of marginalized communities is the second. And today, we have thus brought together leading practitioners from across the world with experts from Japan, France, Spain, South Korea, and United Kingdom. This is an issue that is rising up on the global political agenda. The OECD 2022 recommendation on the social and solidarity economy and social innovation now stands alongside the EU Social Economy Action Plan, the ILO resolution on decent work and social and solidarity economy, and the UN resolution on promoting the social and solidarity economy for sustainable development. These initiatives recognize that the social economy is already a major force. The latest data show that social economy now contributes about 7% of the world's GDP. And within that, the cooperative industry, business owned and controlled by the people who work in the company, rather than the founders or the shareholders, account for 10% of the world's employed population, and the 300 largest cooperatives of mutual organizations generate $2.4 trillion in turnover. In Japan, there are already more than 200,000 social economy organizations, including non-profit entities, cooperatives, and private enterprises, employing close to 6 million people, adding 16 trillion yen to the economy, and accounting for 3.3% of GDP. 3.3% of the GDP is a great number, big number. To give an idea of how significant that is, the entire agricultural sector, by comparison, contributes 1% to Japan's GDP in 2022. So it's more than 3 times bigger than the agricultural sector's contribution to the GDP. But Japan has ambitious plan to go further. As part of the Grand Design and Action Plan for a New Form of Capitalism during Prime Minister Kishida's administration, the term impact, from impact startup to the wider impact economy, covering impact investments and public procurement, has now become much better known in Japan's public and private sector alike. A reminder, and this is equivalent to what might be referred to as a social or social economy in other countries. And most more notably, the Japanese government's 2022 Startup Development 5-year plan seeks to boost investments tenfold up to $70 billion, supported by impact investing. And as part of this ambitious effort to support the social economy, the National Diet's unanimous enactment of Worker Cooperative Act in 2022 was a historic milestone. As has been mentioned by Ms. Ono, for the first time, the Act provides a centralized legal framework which will help to level the playing field for worker cooperatives. And there are opportunities for greater uptake of the law, however. While Spain, for example, saw the launch of 1,287 new work cooperatives in 2021 alone, Japan has only registered 74 as of this year. There is also a need to deepen our evidence and understanding of the role worker cooperatives can play in tackling the key challenges Japan faces and in driving better outcomes for Japan's economy and society. So today we will explore both issues as well as how broader policy measures can support and strengthen worker cooperatives. And OECD is a proud and long-lasting champion of the social economy. We were the first intergovernmental organization to define the concept of social innovation and social enterprises, and we are also the first to have set international standards in this space. And we are proud to support individual countries like Japan in their efforts to strengthen their policies and legal frameworks. So I would like to thank the Japan Institute of Labor Policy and Training for partnering with us to host this international knowledge sharing seminar. It is exactly this type of dialogue for exchanging experiences and information that is needed to scale the social economy. So on the behalf of the OECD, I welcome and wish everyone a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Mr. Takeuchi. And now, after the opening session, it is time for me to give the floor back to Hisu Jiang so that the presentation can start. And I wish us all a very fruitful webinar.
Thank you, Antonella. For those who just joined during the opening remarks, I would like to remind you that simultaneous interpretation services in English and Japanese are available, and you can always leave your questions in the Q&A box as our speakers proceed with their presentations. Now, first of all, Ms. Ono and Mr. Takeuchi, thank you for the wonderful remarks and insights that nicely help us set the tone for today's important discussion. To this end, we have an ambitious agenda in front of us today. As you can see from the screen that's being shared, we will first begin with two background presentations by the OECD's Amal Chevreau, Senior Policy Analyst for Social Economy and Innovation, as well as Mr. Yoshio Mizuno from the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. For the first session immediately after it, our panelists will focus on providing some broader context about the relevant legal frameworks and the wider landscape of worker cooperatives in their respective countries. This will be immediately followed by the second session. That'll be a deep dive into some specific best practice examples of worker cooperative organizations in each country. We will conclude then by sharing some cross-regional and international reactions, being joined by Ms. Diana Dovgan, whose organization Zecopa is a global membership body of national worker cooperative confederations and associations, among many others. We will also have a total of 2 Q&A sessions, one before the second session and one at the very end of the event. We encourage all guests, once again, to submit your questions beforehand in the Q&A box to facilitate a productive and effective conversation. And now to build upon our inspiring welcoming remarks, I invite my colleague Amal to provide an overview of the social economy at large, how cooperatives fit in, and why they matter. Amal?
Thank you very much, Hisu, and I'm very, very pleased and happy to be part of this wonderful event in which we will speak about the social economy, cooperatives, and I will just give a very brief overview of what we've been doing in the space of legal frameworks and how cooperatives fit in and why cooperatives, worker cooperatives are important and matter. Could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So as you may all know, or maybe not, we have been conducting a great initiative called the OECD Global Action on Promoting Social and Solidarity Economy. And this action has covered 33 countries throughout 4 years. And one of the main streams of work of this action was legal frameworks for the social economy. So why am I speaking about that in a webinar dedicated to cooperatives? Because a lot of legislation on cooperative legislation passed or adopted by countries for the social economy is specifically on cooperatives. So just to give you a very a brief overview of what's happening on legal frameworks in general for the social economy, we have found that, for instance, through this work that my colleagues have put links to in the chat, that many countries have adopted what we call national framework laws, which are laws that define the social economy or the social and solidarity economy, or sometimes solidarity economy as it is referred to in many countries. And at least 30 of the countries that we have worked on have adopted almost 100 national specific laws, and a lot of them are on cooperatives, because the cooperative movement is one of the long-standing movements within the social economy. And there is an acceleration of national level laws among target countries in recent years. And of course, one of the countries that adopted recently a legal framework for cooperatives is Japan, with this new worker cooperative law. And as you can see, legislation can happen at national level, but also at subnational level, when there is sometimes sometimes there is no laws at national level. Sometimes subnational governments step in and adopt or complement national laws. And this is the case, for instance, in federal states such as Brazil, Canada, India, Spain, and the United States. And also at city level, as we have seen in the past with Seoul, which has pioneered new approaches to regulating the social and solidarity economy. So now we'll go to what the topic of the day, which is why cooperatives matters and what is a cooperative. Let's begin by asking ourselves this question. So according to the International Cooperative Alliance, and we have a prominent expert on this webinar who will speak a lot more and a lot better than me on this, a cooperative is basically a member-based enterprise, jointly owned and democratically controlled by and for its members. It works depending or using values and principles of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And a lot of these words and these terms maybe do not resonate with everyone, but you can see, and I will explain afterwards why they are very important. And they can be managed by different types of stakeholders, either producers, users, or workers. And usually cooperatives are run according to the one member, one vote rule. The Cooperative Alliance has defined the core principles of cooperatives. And as you can see, we have 7 of them. Voluntary and open membership, which means that people, when they go into cooperatives, they accept the responsibilities and they also accept to participate in the governance of their cooperatives. Democratic control, the one member, one vote rule. Member economic participation, they have to bring in something. Autonomy and independence, education and training and information. And this is one of the key elements that also resonate with the fact that worker cooperatives are great platforms for providing work, because they train and they also provide valuable information to their members. Cooperation among cooperatives, and most of all, concern for the community. And I will explain now, if we go to the next slide, to what are the types of cooperatives. So as I said in the beginning, cooperatives can broadly be divided into 4 types: consumer cooperatives, worker cooperatives, multi-stakeholder, and a producer. Depending on the type, there is always the interest of serving the members, but also serving the community. So when they're established by consumers, they're established and owned by consumers to supply their own needs and gain bargaining power, for instance. And I give here some examples of cooperatives, consumer cooperatives in some of the countries that are represented in the panel today, like Eroxy, from Spain, for instance. Producer cooperatives are established and owned, for instance, by people who produce goods or services, such as farmers or artists. And the idea is for them to process, market, and distribute their goods and services. and they can work together or separately. So you have the whole definition here. One of the examples is the group In Vivo in France is one of the largest agricultural groups in France and producer groups. And we have also what we call multi-stakeholder cooperatives. And in these cooperatives, you can have different types of stakeholders, including national or subnational authorities. And there is an example in the slide. And last and not least, worker cooperatives, which main purpose is to provide jobs for their members. And they have the possibility of being organized, including as startups or as conversion of existing businesses. And I give just here two of the three examples, one from France, very well known, Group Up, Mondragon, of course, from Spain, and Utsuwa from Japan, which was recently created after the adoption of the new Worker Cooperative Act in Japan. Next slide, please. So we've conducted as Antonella hinted in her opening remarks, we've conducted research into 34 countries on different legal forms, and cooperatives come as one of the top 3 legal forms of social economy organizations in 34 countries. And they are active alongside with associations and foundations. And we have found that they're active in different economic and social sectors, such as agriculture, education, industry, culture, services, infrastructure, and even, of course, electricity and water. Next slide, please. So why are they important? Because of the many reasons that we all know here, or maybe not. First of all, the report on exploring the cooperative economy, for instance, indicates that the top 300 cooperatives, for instance, generated 2.4 trillion US dollars in turnover, and there are at least 280 million people who are employed by cooperatives across the world, which represent more or less 10% of the world's employed population. Cooperatives can bring a lot of benefits to economies and societies. They prioritize serving local communities. If you remember, one of the core principles is concern for the community. They maintain, or they try to maintain as much as possible, value locally, even when they go international, like the Group Mondragon, for instance, or Group Up. Social innovation and community wealth building is at the core of their business in general, and they also favor interactions among local actors. They're very active in the provision of local services, and they reach out, or they reach as much as possible disadvantaged or specific groups, such as people with disabilities, women, and a lot of, for instance, in many countries in Europe, for instance, they also integrate refugees. Next slide, please. So why are worker cooperatives important? Because they simply create jobs, contribute to better conditions, working conditions, and serve local communities. Again, as Antonella hinted in her opening remarks, we conducted work on their contribution, for instance, to the digital transition through platform cooperatives, but also through the transition from informal to formal jobs in Colombia. And what we have found in both cases is that worker cooperatives bring a lot of benefits to people who are engaged in them. First of all, they have, yes, thank you, Hisu, for the kind reminder. They voice and take part in decisions. Better earnings, we have seen that in the case of platform cooperatives, for instance, more flexible working conditions, and training and skills development opportunities, accountability and transparency, and a better perception of work. And I come to my very last slide. So you'll see here, so I respect time. If you want to know more about OECD work on legal frameworks, social impact measurement, and data, please feel free to visit our website. We have, as it was mentioned, produced policy guides, but we also have specific work on designing legal frameworks for social enterprises. We have a set of country fact sheets for 34 countries where we have compiled information about legal frameworks, also including if countries have acts or laws on cooperatives. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Amal, for your presentation. If you're interested in learning more about our work at the OECD Social Economy Innovation Unit, you can always reach out to us, but also refer back to the links that my colleague Melis has already shared in the chat box. Now we pivot to understanding what's going on in Japan, as it has just recently ratified and put into effect a groundbreaking law specifically tailored to worker cooperatives. Mr. Yoshio Mizuno, our next presenter, is the head of the Workers' Cooperative Office at the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare with 2 decades of policymaking experience. Welcome, Mizuno-san. You now have the floor.
はい、日本国政府厚生労働省の、労働者協同組合業務士長の水野と申します。本日は貴重な機会をいただきましてどうもありがとうございます。よろしくお願いします。次のページをお願いします。日本では、労働者協同組合法という法律が、先ほど話がありましたけども、国会議員の先生方が、議論をする中で、2020年に法律が、成立をして、2022年の10月からこの労働者協同組合という法制度がスタートしています。その中ではまさに資金を出し合って、話し合って営む、共に働くという形での法人の制度というところになっています。次のページをお願いします。今の現状ですけども、この資料の中では、2月の19日現在73法人ということになっておりますが、直近で増えておりまして、3月の12日、今日時点で、77法人が設立をされております。まだまだ少ないですが、2週間に1度、1法人というペースで、法人が生まれているという状況にあります。具体的なその取り組みの内容としても、キャンプ場の経営、総裁業、メディア制作経験、制作体験、カフェ、フェスティバル運営といったものから、高齢者介護、生活困窮者支援、子育て支援、このように非常に多岐にわたる法人ができております。その法人ができる、いわゆる類型としても、この法律ができる前に NPO ですとか企業組合といった法人類型で実施してきたのが、この12と書いてありますが、13法人、残りが新規設立で64法人というところで、法律が生まれ、制度がスタートした2022年の10月から多くの法人さんがこの働き方を選んでいただいたということと理解をしています。次のスライドをお願いします。この日本の法制度の特色であります。一つ目としては、多くの事業ができるということで、労働者派遣事業以外は、すべてできるというところで、さっき申し上げたキャンプ場の経営といったところから非常に様々な法人があります。二つ目は、もうこれはすでに議論されていますけども、組合員の議決権、選挙権は平等というところです。で、三つ目が、これが日本の法人制度の中でも特徴的ですけども、今多い NPO 法人、こういった法人ですと、行政庁による許認可が必要となってまいりますが、労働者協同組合の場合には、登記をすれば法人格が付与できるということで、極めて簡便に法人格が取得できるというところが、この日本国内では、特徴的になっております。で、4つ目ですけども、違憲範囲の重視ということで、これは平等な立場でなされる。で、5番目が非常に特徴的でして、組合員は、労働基準法、最低賃金法、労働組合法などの法令によって、労働者として保護されるということで、労働契約を締結する必要があります。また、ここ書いておりませんけども、組合員の中で、組合員のうち5分の4以上が事業に従事をしなければならないですとか、事業に従事する人のうち4分の3以上が組合員ではならなければならないという従事要件が、設定されているのが特徴であります。5つ目としては出資配当ができないというところです。で、次のスライドをお願いいたします。法律ができてから1年5ヶ月ぐらい経っているわけですが、大体4つぐらいニーズが出てきておりまして、1つ目は、この法人がかなり簡単に法人格が取得できるっていうところもあるので、ありますが、本業を持ちながら仲間と協力しながら副業、兼業といった形での法人格が 働き方がなされています。2つ目が自治会地域おこし協力隊による地域コミュニティの活性化というところで、地域の困りごとを仕事にしたいというニーズに応えられていると思います。3つ目として、これかなり今後期待されているところですけども、高齢者の健康づく、企業を辞められた後、組織の退職後の生きがいを感じながら元気に仕事をしていきたいというニーズが生まれてきているのかなというふうに思いますし、4つ目として、器のお話がありましたが、障害者福祉や介護の現場といった実際のケアワーカーの皆さんが、ケアをするだけじゃなくて、運営も自分たちで担いたいという観点から、労働者協同組合法人を立てられているといった事業がございます。その他事例は、次のページ、その次のページでも事例が書かれておりますので、ご覧いただければと思います。私からは以上です。ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you, Ms. No-san. We will now step into what many of us here have been waiting for, to cross-compare and learn from many of our impressive speakers from many countries, including Japan, Korea, France, UK, and Spain. And as part of that, as for the first speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Jean-Louis Bancel, who will share some of his expertise and experience from the case of France. Jean-Louis?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you today, and I want to thank the OECD for the job done on this matter. And I'm also so glad to be in contact with our Japanese colleague. I am so glad since I've been there to help the agriculture co-ops and all sectors to see things moving on. Next slide, please. So about France, in a nutshell, it's the worker co-ops, it's a 200 years history. I won't expand a lot on that, but you do understand that since then, since I've changed a lot. So the first worker co-op was founded in France in 1831. And then you can see on the slide that slowly things went up. It's not by the size that the thing is the most important. It's what it has, the influence it has on the cooperative sector in France. So the first legal framework was set in 1867, and 140 years ago, we created the first public bank for co-ops, which was a credit cooperative, which I chaired for 15 years. So in 1915, just during the First World War, there was a provision in the legal framework, in the labor code about co-ops. That was the first time that there was a linkage between the worker legal system and the worker co-ops. And in 1947, we set a global legislation in France, a global law on co-ops, and inside it, there is from there a special provision for worker co-ops. I won't expand much about it. So now in France, we have changed the callings. We don't call them only worker co-ops. We call them participatory co-ops, because in between the foundation and now, we have now 3 different types of what you internationally call worker co-op. What we call the SCOP, Société Coopérative Participative, which is the classical way of doing things. And now 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, we created SIC, Société Coopérative d'Intérêt Collectif, in which you can gather different type of, it's a multi-stakeholder type of co-ops, but with workers inside. And the last but not the least is what we call coopératives d'activité et d'emploi, which are new types of for self-employed people to start working and being individuals, but starting working into co-ops. Next slide. So just to give few figures. The amount there might seem not that big, because you can see there are almost 4,500 SCOPs and SIC in France, compared to the global number, which is 22,600 co-ops, which is quite small, but the influence is huge. On the number of jobs, you can see almost 85,000 jobs compared to 1.3 million. So you can see it's a tiny part of the co-ops, but very influential. And the last is a turnover, almost 9.5 billion euros, compared to the global turnover, which is 1.3 billions. Through trillions of euros. So something which is important on this slide is that you can see 70% of the workers inside the co-ops are members of the co-ops, because you have two positions. You're a worker, you're a member. So 70%, they decide voluntarily, as said by Amal, to be a member. And the last, but not the least, most important, is the resilience of worker co-ops. If ever you look on a 5-year range vision, they are much more resilient than the classical forms of enterprise. So next slide, you can have there the way the jobs are in the country, but I won't expand on that. And I will finish with the last line. Next slide is how they are deeply rooted in our economy. They are in different sectors. Classical are craftsmanship, builders, but some are getting in new sectors, such as, of course, IT or other things. I want to show you something I'm just setting on. A new gathering of co-ops, licorns, which are a new type of worker co-ops getting out. And so four more points I want to finish with. So worker co-ops are very useful to be used for when someone from a classical enterprise is retiring to take over. That's very important in a declining demographic country. I believe it might be something interesting in Japan and other countries to start a new type of activities in new sectors, IT, innovation, and so on. So Licorne is a good example. And to run more platforms, that's something which is very important, new types of platforms, and of course, close relations with local authorities. So if ever you want to know better, but I'm sure Diana would talk about it, the influence of workers buyout, there is a wonderful report which has been recently, it doesn't show that much, published by CCOP on the workers buyout, but I'm sure Diana will tackle that. So that's what I wanted to, in a nutshell, tell about France, but maybe in the chat or in the questions, things will come up. Thank you.
Thank you, John Louis. As you mentioned, we'll definitely go over some of the more international perspective at the end of the day with you and Diana from Sicopa. But certainly one key takeaway that I noticed from your presentation is the worker cooperatives' resilient sustainability, even compared to the private sector counterparts. On that note, I now want to move to another country with an equally robust and a long history of worker cooperative sector, which is Spain. And for Spain, we'll have Ms. Amaya Delgado from the Spanish Confederation of Worker Cooperatives, or COSETA. Amaya, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello, good morning. Good morning in Europe, good afternoon in Japan. I'm pleased to represent COSETA here in this webinar. I want to thank the OCDE for the invitation and organizing this interesting webinar to share knowledge and best practices. COSETA, next slide, please. COSETA is the Spanish Federation of Workers' Cooperatives. It represents 15 regional organizations that gathers around 80,000 cooperatives and more than 315,000 workers. Next slide, please. The legal framework, the Spanish legal framework is based in two laws. We have the law on cooperatives that is dated in 1999, and it regulates the formation, functioning, and dissolution of cooperatives. And also we have the law on cooperative taxation that it came from 1919, and it explains the special tax regime for cooperatives. As you can see, these laws are not very new. So currently, the social economy ecosystem is working to renovate them. We started the process last year, but because of the change in the government, now the process is on standby. The renovation of the law on social economy, that will be named the Law to Boost Social Economy, that will cover cooperative, mutual societies, social integration enterprises, labor companies, associations, and foundings, will also include the update of the law on cooperatives. Only the law on cooperatives. We still have to start the process to update the law on cooperative taxation. If you visited Spain, perhaps you know that in Spain we have 17 regions. So we have 70 laws. Well, in reality, we have 18 laws because we have the 17 regional laws and the national law. The national law applies to cooperatives that operates in more than two regions, and the rest of the cooperatives operates under the regional law. The tax exception that the law on cooperative taxation applies are in the corporate income tax. We have a reduction from 25% to 20%, and also we have a 50% additional reduction in the amount that cooperatives have to pay. We also have reduction in the value-added tax, the tax of business activity, that we have a 95% reduction, and in the local property tax that we also enjoy a 95% reduction. Our legal framework also allows economic and representative integration structures. For example, second-degree cooperatives and cooperative groups. The cooperative groups are not still a legal recognized entity, and sometimes we face some problems, for example, applying for tenders, but we are working also on it. Next slide, please. The process to open a cooperative is not very smooth, unfortunately, and it can take from weeks to months. The registries, the national and the regional, are not very effective. And for example, a social entrepreneur who wants to open a cooperative sometimes quit the process because in 24 hours they can open a commercial enterprise, and we have to wait a couple of weeks. So we are facing this challenge in Spain. Cooperative legislation widely recognizes that any lawful economic activity can be organized and developed through a cooperative society. Minimum capital depends on the law. From €1 in Madrid, that is the capital of Spain, but the general amount is €3,000. The condition is that all contributions should be equal to all members. Obviously, our laws follow the cooperative principles, and this is clear. The minimum number of members is 3. In the update of the law, we are thinking to change it to 2, because in many of the regional laws, the minimum number now is 2. And workers should be less than 20% of the numbers of the members of the cooperatives. Obviously, our law, as I said before, we follow the cooperative principle. So participation in decision-making is democratic, based on one vote, one worker. Governance is organized by the assembly, the board, and the director. And also the law establishes the non-distributable funds, the mandatory reserve funds that normally it varies between 20 and 30% of the surplus, and education fund that is establishing 5% of the surplus in all the regional laws. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned before, in Spain, there are around 80,000 workers' cooperatives that employs more than 350,000. Workers' cooperatives represent 5.5% of the GDP, and 51% of their workers are women. Next slide, please. And some statistics, you can see here that workers' cooperatives are the majority of the cooperatives in Spain, followed by the agricultural cooperatives. And the region that has more cooperatives are Andalusia, Catalonia, and the Basque Country. We will see some examples and best practices from Basque Country, Asturias, and Madrid in the second part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amaya. I believe the tax reduction and incentives that you mentioned are probably of significant interest to many of our speakers and audience. And I think I already noticed one member of our audience who asked a question about incentives. We'll get back to that during our Q&A session. But for the time being, we'll now transition into the case of the United Kingdom, which is quite a distinct approach at the policymaking level. John, who is the executive director of Workers.coop, likewise another national confederation of worker cooperatives in the country. The floor is now yours.
Thanks. So I'll go straight into the legal structure. Next slide. And ours is really simple. There is no specific legal form for worker co-ops. So most worker cooperatives register as companies. Some register as societies, which is the traditional form for credit unions and consumer co-ops. Because of this no legal form, there are clearly no legal benefits to being a worker co-op, but there are also no financial or tax benefits that can be assigned to worker co-ops. So really, in the case of the law, worker cooperatives are invisible. They're also quite invisible in broader public awareness because of that lack of legal structure. So most worker cooperatives, for all intents and purposes, look like any other private business. And unless they brand themselves as a worker co-op, the client, the customer, would never know. Quite a lot of worker co-ops do brand themselves as social enterprises or not-for-profits as well. In the UK, there's also no legal concept of worker-owner. So we have very clear employee legislation and legislation covering self-employed people, and there is no separate distinction as a worker-owner. What is quite interesting is in the last few years, the employee ownership world, the sector, have lobbied very effectively for tax benefits. And so to be an employee-owned trust, as it's called in the UK, like John Lewis, there are some tax benefits. Next slide. So there is a recent increasing trend in worker co-ops, partly because of the rising inequality in the UK, the poor economy, and particularly the poor treatment of workers. We are seeing more interest in the model, but it's quite difficult to get cut through because of this lack of legal structure. There is also an interesting trend towards hybrid worker co-ops, where there are some employees, but an increasing number of self-employed members within that worker co-op, or pure co-ops of self-employed people. And as I mentioned, most worker co-ops now are registering as companies. Our biggest growing sector is the tech sector, and this is very much to do with the fact that you can set up a tech co-op very quickly with low capital, and it's really all about the value derived from the labour, the people giving their labour to the co-op, and that's our biggest growth area. But as I mentioned, because of the recent tax benefits to setting up an employee ownership trust, they have had a huge growth in this sector, and it's really because it's a very clear solution to a problem, the problem of business owners retiring and the need really for selling that business. And so they have been very effective at positioning employee-owned businesses as a solution to business succession. And of course, there are tax benefits. Next slide. So just a quick graph of the growth of worker co-ops, or the lack of growth of worker co-ops. We have around 400 worker co-ops in the UK and another 250 co-ops of self-employed people. And we're kind of creating around 15 to 20 a year. So quite small compared to some countries, but it's stable with small growth, I would say. Next slide. Looking quickly at some industry sectors. As I mentioned, traditionally, our largest sector is retail. So that's cafes, food shops, bike shops, those sorts of retail shops. But increasingly, most of our new worker cooperatives are in the professional services, accountants, architects, things like that, or increasingly tech co-ops, web developers, communications agencies, brand agency, marketing agencies, those sorts of areas. So that's a great sign really for our economy. Next slide. So just really quick learnings from the past. At our height, we had 1,500 worker co-ops, and that was because there was an Act of Parliament defining worker co-ops. There was a national body that dissolved in 2000, and a National Institute organisation, as well as a government-funded network of local advisors. So the reason why the worker co-op economy has shrunk and now reforming is because of that lack of infrastructure, and the main reason we have created Workers.coop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It was interesting to learn about the somewhat unique laissez-faire, if you will, model of policymaking existing in the UK. But obviously, the Act of Parliament defining worker co-ops is certainly set the standards, is helping your sector grow amid challenges. The growing trend of tech-based worker cooperatives, John Louis also touched upon this, how IT is becoming a big thing in France. And I think we might have to touch upon this later during our panel session and Q&A. But for the time being, last but not least, we will now have Hyung-Sik from the International Cooperative Alliance. He will represent South Korea's case today for his presentation. And as a country that's neighboring Japan, I'm sure it'll be of interest to some of our Japanese guests in the audience. Hyung-Sik?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for thank you OECD for this the opportunity to share the history of the worker cooperative in Korea to international audience, also with the Japanese friend. I just made very short presentation because I wanted to keep my time limit, because we have the very complicated story of the worker cooperative. So I will start from this table, because when we talk about the workers cooperative in Korea, we need to think two different the dimension. One is that the worker cooperatives in legal sense, which are recognized, created by, according to the Framework Act on Cooperatives, which was introduced in 2012. But we have very large the sector of the worker cooperative de facto from 1990s, which actually was the origin of the legal worker cooperative as well. So I'd like to mention these two different worker cooperatives in Korea. So in 1990s, the worker cooperative idea has been elaborated and tested by the social movement working in the poor urban area to help the poor people to create their own job. So that was idea, the beginning. But at the time, there was no legal the status for the worker cooperative. So all initiatives have had been created in using different the legal status, but they kept the idea of the cooperative, particularly worker cooperative, very strongly inspired by the history of the Mondragon case. And then this idea was taken by the government, which looked for having the public program to support the poor people. So that idea has been was included in the new law on the National Livelihood Security Act, which is every country now in advanced countries have the legal system to support the people to guarantee the minimum life with some the revenue guarantee. But this law was introduced in 2000, and as part of this the legislation, the idea of the worker cooperatives was included. So if someone, for people who can work, they need to be involved in the program called self-sufficiency program. And then they can try to create their own enterprise called self-sufficiency enterprise in a form of worker cooperatives. So that was actually the government and this public program support strongly the creation of the worker cooperative type enterprise nationwide. And then they developed many new activities and create many jobs in different, and also the very interesting the business model I will introduce later. So today, in the framework, there are 1,012 self-sufficiency enterprises exist in Korea, mainly in the cleaning, construction, catering, delivery service, social services, etc. I would say they are not all worker cooperative type now. They are many of them are now the small, just the private SME model, but still there are the strong tendency that they wanted to make their enterprise in a more worker cooperative way. And they are represented by Korea Self-Sufficiency Enterprise Association in Korea. And from this origin, as you must know, the Korea's history of the social economy actually stimulated by the self-sufficiency enterprise, which now led to the introduction of the social enterprise law, and finally in 2012 the Framework Act on the cooperative legislation was introduced in the frame of the larger social economy idea, and which was stimulated by self-sufficiency enterprises. So in the 2012, new legislation on cooperatives was introduced. Before this legislation, Korea had 8 different sectoral legislation for specific sectors like agriculture, fishery, consumer, etc. But no worker cooperatives. But with this Framework Act, which allow creating any type of cooperatives in any type of the economic sector. That was the new era of the cooperative movement in Korea. So with this Framework Act, there have been 19,400 cooperatives have been created until 2020. It's a very big number, but among them, only the 600 were the worker cooperatives. So these 600 worker cooperatives are working mainly in the education, the wholesale and retail sector, art, sports, and leisure sector, and other personal services. And there is the Korean Federation of Worker Cooperatives, which represent this worker cooperatives movement, but they are still very, very small. I would say these 2 different family of the worker cooperative in Korea coexist. And the original idea was that with the legislation, probably many of the self-sufficiency enterprise based on the worker cooperative model might be converted to worker cooperatives. But it was not the case in Korea, because these self-sufficiency enterprises had already their own place in the market or in their institutional situation. So it was very difficult to change their legal status. So although most of them are working in the spirit of worker cooperatives, they are not legally always the cooperatives, worker cooperatives in the legal sense. Only 10% of them have the cooperative status. So, but on the other hand, in the worker cooperative, according to the Framework Act, as I said, it's only 600, and they are economically quite weak still, because they had to develop their business without any specific support from government or other partners. So they are struggling in the market. And as I will explain a little bit more in detail, there are some interesting cases, but in terms of this the worker cooperatives under the Framework Act is still we need to see how they will develop. It's still emerging stage, I would say. So, but I want to just emphasize that to further self-sufficient enterprise, there have been many the public policies to support these initiatives, and that was the reason how they can now reach the 1,000 enterprise and also create many jobs for the vulnerable people, and also it was not only under this policy, but also there have been in parallel the policy development for the social service sector or the housing welfare the program or etc. So these parallel the development of the sectoral or economic activity policies really help to structure the business of the self-sufficient enterprise to give them more the power in the market, also create the more jobs. So, but still the challenge in Korea would be how we can combine these two initiatives originally from the same idea, but institutionally differently structured. And I believe that in Japan, actually the many of the idea in Korea came from actually the Japanese worker cooperative movement. So we consider them the big brother, but we also know that Japan already has very strong worker cooperative movement, but with this new legislation, it would be also something to consider how really this movement can be developed with this new legislation, because it's not always easy to combine the different approach around the legal sense and also the cooperative de facto. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hyung-sik, for sharing the context in Korea. And as Hyung-sik mentioned, it's interesting to see the connecting dots between Japan and Korea's shared experience of sort of streamlining and centralizing many laws that existed related to cooperatives. And thank you once again for everybody's presentation from our panel. We have enough time for our first round of Q&A. And to sort of start this off, I want to address one question that was in our Q&A box from Ari Trinurini Adi. What kind of incentive can the government provide for cooperatives and social economy enterprises in Japan and France? But obviously, we can extend this to other countries. And in general, I want to sort of reapply this question in a way, for our panel as experts in your countries for worker cooperatives. In your ideal world, what kind of incentives and benefits would you hope to see for worker cooperatives? Does anyone want to take that question first? Jean-Louis?
Yes, I won't expand a lot on that, but of course it's always very difficult to go on all technicalities on tax, but you have to understand that in France, for a long time now, we have a special alleviation of tax for the workers investing in their own co-op, their own company. And that's very important. One of the weakness of the worker co-ops is the capital. So one of the problem is it is hard to get huge worker co-ops in very high intensive capital sector, such as industry and so on. So that's why in history and geographically, mostly co-ops are very important in the services, in craftsmanship and so on. So we are trying to find ways, but I will tackle that later on financial matters. So that's one of the way we could help and expand worker co-ops. Thank you.
Thank you. Amaya, can I follow up on your presentation when you mentioned about tax benefits? But so I'm just curious about what the implications of this benefit has been for your country's sector of worker cooperatives. And are there any other benefits and incentives that you think were notable?
Okay, so yes, tax incentives obviously helps a lot, because sometimes when people want to start a business and you know the amount of money that they have to invest is not very high, having the opportunity to apply these reductions are very important. Obviously, Spain has a level of taxation I think that in the way that all the European countries that perhaps can be thought to be high. So all this tax reduction helps a lot to encourage them to open a social enterprise. Also, from last September, we also were able to establish another benefit that I think it's, at least I think here in Spain, is helping us in the cooperative, in the workers' cooperative, because now you can apply, you can ask to receive all your unemployment benefit to buy or to invest it in the minimum social capital to open or to join a cooperative. Okay, so here in Spain, it's been very, very helpful, because until September, you have to be in an employment situation to ask for this. But nowadays, if you are working in a cooperative, or you have a job but you want to join a cooperative, you can apply for this unemployment amount of your rights to open a cooperative.
Thank you, Amaya. Sorry. Thank you, Amaya. Does anybody else want to take on this question about incentives and benefits? Oh, John, yes, please.
Yeah, so the real example of the employee ownership trusts in the UK, because the tax benefit was very targeted, so it was targeted at capital gains for the seller of the business, and it wasn't an amazing tax benefit, but because it existed, it really did trigger people to have the conversation. So sometimes the tax benefit is as useful as a trigger to a conversation with an accountant as it is for the actual financial benefit itself. Thanks.
Thank you. And now I would like to move into a more Japan-specific question from Santosh Kumar Padmanabhan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But the question is, Mizuno-san, and I would love your help in answering this. The question is, do the legal experts from Japan see any complementarity between the SME co-op law from 1949 and the Worker Co-op Act, particularly for self-employed entrepreneurs in Japan? So once again, this addresses the intersection and the connection between various laws that exist in your country. So would you mind chiming on this question?
そうですね。今回のこの労働者協同組合法は、今ご指摘いただいた中小企業の法律、いわゆる日本ですと企業組合っていう名前の法人格があり、そことかなり似せて作っておりますけども、その企業組合を選んでいた方々が労働者協同組合に移るっていうのが現象としてあります。それは目的が企業組合は営利中心であったことから、労働者協同組合の場合には、今回のその目的が、持続的な、持続可能な、可能で地域社会の実現というところで目的がなされているので、その目的のところから、労働者協同組合を選びたいというふうに思われている方が多いんじゃないかなというふうに思います。そういう意味では目的がかなり違うところが、この法人の一つ、差別的になっているところなのかなというふうに思います。
Thank you. And last but not least, we do have a question about specific case studies on marginalized people, but for Mr. John Whitman, we'll actually address this question in our second part of the Q&A, because in fact, our second session will focus on sort of deeper dive examples into best practice worker cooperatives. And on that note, Hyung-sik, in reverse order from the first panel, I would like you to first begin with some specific examples that you know of from South Korea.
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce two cases from the South Korean the worker cooperatives. as I mentioned, there is two different family. One is that worker cooperatives according to the Framework Act, and the other is the worker cooperative de facto. So the first case is from the worker cooperative according to the Framework Act. The Happy Bridge is the one of the probably biggest the worker cooperative in Korea, and actually they were like the private company created by a group of friends who were engaged in the social movement, and as company they worked as like the headquarters of the restaurant franchising. So it was already very successful business before becoming cooperatives, but even before the Framework Act, this company tried to make their company as more more in a cooperative way, giving more power and voice to employees, and then the making very the good the working culture, working condition, and but it was not legally or structurally made. But when the Framework Act was introduced, the Happy Bridge, this company, decided to convert themselves to the worker cooperatives, because they already started the studying about the cooperative model. They already organized some study trip to Spain, France, UK to learn about worker cooperatives even before the Framework Act. And when with the Framework Act, they converted their status to the worker cooperatives. And they started also working like the leader of the worker cooperative movement in Korea. As I mentioned, in the Korea Federation of the Worker Cooperatives, Happy Bridge had taken very important role and leading role for other cooperatives. And also they created the constructive the collaboration with the Mondragon Group through their subsidiary, originally subsidiary, but it became now the independent cooperative ATBM Research Cooperatives, which is now the managing several the training and the research program for the workers cooperatives in Korea. So they have also the very close the collaboration with the Mondragon Group and Mondragon University to manage some the training programs. So if you are interested, this is the reason I introduced this the case is that it's economically success case, and also it has very in Korean it brought many discussion about the worker cooperative model, and also inside Happy Bridge there was big discussion about the change of identity of enterprise. Brought many internal discussion, debate, and also the difficulties. So you can find many the English articles on this Happy Bridge case. That's the reason I introduced this case, because you might study more with the available English articles, because that was it was very focus of the many the study on worker cooperative in Korea. And then the second case is from the worker cooperative de facto. As I mentioned, the self-sufficiency enterprises. As I mentioned, there were many the public programs to support these self-sufficient enterprises. Among them, there was a project to the promoting some specific sectors, which have more potential to develop, like construction, care service, cleaning, and the recycling. So these four sectors have received more the support from the government, also from the various partners, to structure this industry as a very important part of this the social self-sufficient enterprise activities. So one of the sector was the construction, and then in that sector, the self-sufficient enterprises could make their own network at the regional level, also the national level. And this the network of the self-sufficient enterprise in construction sector became social cooperatives in Korea. With the Framework Act, they can also make social cooperatives. which has the more explicit social aim and the non-profit distribution constraint. So this network became social cooperatives called Korea Housing Welfare Social Cooperatives, which have very complicated structure as the network, also regional network, and individual self-sufficient enterprises, which allow to have the economic scale to negotiate with the government to have more favorable public policy. For example, they are now engaged in the public program for maintenance of the housing allowance beneficiaries' house. This is very big, the market, and also for social purpose to support the poor people, financed by government, also partly by the the private enterprises. And this market is, I would say, the dedicated to this self-sufficient enterprise. So compared to, I said, the worker cooperative in legal sense, which have to work in the market as more independent initiatives, the worker cooperative model in the self-sufficiency enterprise have many the best cases like this, which not only their own power or the capacity to develop, but also having very favorable ecosystem and public support, and also structure themselves as more network. This allow to develop further their business, also their activity. So you can find the report on this case in one of the ILO report. Myself and my colleague Professor Eric Bide contribute. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hyung-sik. It's interesting to see a Korean cooperative that was inspired and it's actually working with a Spanish cooperative with the Mondragon Group, which is one of the largest cooperatives in the world. And I think that attests to this growing sector and the internationalization of it. Speaking of which, we do have a report recently on internationalization of the social economy, and you can access that in our full list of publications that Melis has shared in the chat. And on that note, I would like to move into the United Kingdom's best practice case studies from John.
So yeah, we've got two case studies. The first is Suma based in West Yorkshire, which is a economically more deprived area of the UK, is a wholesaler. It provides goods to resale in retail shops. There are around 5 other similar worker cooperatives in the UK, but Suma is by far the largest in this sector, with a turnover of 70 million. It has around 250 members, core members, but 350 workers in total, partly down to seasonal work. It gets very busy in the lead up to Christmas. What's interesting about Suma is they operate equal pay. So everybody in the organisation is on the same pay, flat pay, of around £35,000 a year. And so for context in the sector, this is 20 to 30% higher than it would be for similar roles in a similar sector. And so that's very much the worker co-op premium. They can do that in an incredibly competitive market because they do not pay high salaries to a senior leadership team. They operate multi-role, and what that means is they typically spend their time between labour-intensive roles in the warehouse and mentally intensive roles such as marketing, management. And so because everybody splits between labour and mental office-based roles, they can, one, pay everybody the same rate, and it distributes the leadership and the management between the workforce. But it also means during very high capacity periods, they can move into the warehouse and take on those labour roles. So it's a very flexible workplace and a very, very competitive workplace in a very competitive market in the UK. They did struggle, like many of our businesses, through COVID, but they are coming back very strong now. The last thing to say about Suma is they operate a flattish management structure. So they do not have a CEO or a managing director. They do have appointed management roles, but their famous saying and quote in the UK is management is a function, not a status. So very much they manage to coordinate, but those people are not for power organizing. Only they're democratically like the UK. So moving on to the next case study. The next case study is Outlandish, and Outlandish are very typical of a lot of our smaller tech co-ops. So Outlandish are based in London, Islington. They are a tech agency. They build websites. They do data projects for people like the BBC, the UN, people like that. They're very small, with a small core team of around 5 or 6, but they work with a much larger network of expert freelancers in specialist tech roles. They have a turnover of around 1 million, but this varies, and they operate what's called a sociocratic structure, which is a radical flat structure, so no managers at all, and the organization is very organic in how it grows and shrinks based on the nature of the projects they have. So it's a very interesting model, but similar to a lot of our other tech co-ops, and why there's lots of growth in this sector, because the nature of flatter pay, if not flat pay, the nature of less management, more agile and flexible ways of managing projects is really attractive in that industry. And so the worker co-op model is quite attractive as a solution in that industry. 2 other final things Outlandish do that's really interesting as a best practice is they are one of the founder members of a tech sector organization, which has helped grow a further 30 tech co-ops in the UK. And they were a founding member of that. And one of the reasons Workers.coop was created to replicate that success. And they've also created something called Space 4, which is an incubation unit, an incubation space in London, again, to become a hub for tech businesses and to grow new worker co-ops in the tech sector. And they can do these things because they are an incredibly profitable and successful small tech agency. Those are my 2 case studies. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think your cases are very interesting in that it really attests to the sort of sustainable and equitable governance structures of these worker cooperatives, regardless of their size. And certainly, you know, as somebody who studied in the UK as well, I can certainly attest to the fact that the equal pay structure of your first case study is definitely not low in the UK job market, especially from an entry-level standpoint. And so that's really interesting. Thank you for all these examples. And now we want to move into Spain's case. Amaya, you can have the floor again. And I think for Spain, size will be quite an interesting highlight here because of the scale, the sheer scale of these cooperatives. And Amaya, you will have more to tell.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to share 3 different examples. 2 are big. We are talking about a scale, but the third one is a small example that I also wanted to share. Obviously, I had to share a cooperative being part of Mondragon Corporation. In Spain, all of you knows Mondragon, so I choose Orbea. Orbea is a bicycle manufacturer based in Mayavia in the Basque Country. It competes with worldwide brands as Giant, Scott, or Cannondale. If you like cycling, I'm sure you know Orbea. Orbea design and produce the bikes in their own factory in Mayavia, and also they have a small factory in Portugal. The origin of Orbea is a family business in the 19th century. It was a family business dedicated to produce guns and rifles. This is why Orbea tells that it's a story of reinvention, because the change is 100%. In the 1930s, the family business started to produce bicycles, and it became a cooperative during a crisis in 1969 under very difficult financial circumstances. The workers bought the company to the Orbea family. They created the cooperative, and 2 years after that, the cooperative joined Mondragon Corporation. After years of more or less stabilization business, in the last 10 years, Orbea has changed. It has become a worldwide competitor. In 2022, had its 7th consecutive record sales year, hitting 400 million euros. And for me, it's amazing that being in this growth process, 82% increase on sales, and now with a workforce over 1,000 workers, they still share, live in the cooperative principles. You know, I've been visiting Orbea in November, and it's amazing how they live the cooperative principles, how proud they are of being a cooperative, being such an amazing company. You see, 85% of its business is international. Orbea produces road, mountain, triathlon bicycles, and obviously they are in the urban business. Nowadays, electrical bicycles are one of the key sector business of Orbea. And being a brand, they sponsor professional teams, professional riders, and they are on top of the brand and marketing business in the international cycling business. Next slide, please. Gredos San Diego, this is an educational cooperative. They are based in Madrid, the capital of Spain. Also, they share a story about transformation, because the origin, it's a family business also. Julio Lopez was the owner, and in 1985, during the retirement process of the founder, 18 of the workers, not only teachers, also part of the administrative and service staff, decided to continue with the business. Gredos San Diego School originally was based in a humble neighborhood in Madrid. So they created the opportunity to have a very liberal, secular education in this neighborhood in Madrid. Obviously, now the cooperative has grown, and they manage 8 schools in Madrid, 3 internationals, one in Madrid and the others in Costa Rica and Cameroon. The workforce is 1,500, and more than 1,000 are members in the cooperatives. So completely different project than Orbea. Is a service, is not a manufacturer company, but also, you know, sharing. And for me, it's very important teaching the new generations the cooperative principles. That at least in Spain, we have this challenge, no, to connect with new generation, to teach, to learn from them, and also to invite them to being a part of the social economy. And the third one, this is a very small cooperative in Asturias, also in the north of Spain. The cooperative is made by 8 members. They saw a new niche in the market, that was the ecological courier service. So they started in the hometown in Gijón, and the second biggest city in Asturias, Oviedo. They started riding the bicycles with mensajeros Luna. Luna is moon in Spanish, but nowadays they provide, you know, international courier service, domestic transport service, around the world. They have the headquarters still in Asturias. You know, for the cooperative movement, it's essential to be connected with the territory. So they still are in Asturias, but they have international offices in Madrid, Barcelona, and also in New York, Londres, and Dublin. So, you know, they saw a new service. They saw the opportunity to provide it in an ecological way, and they created the cooperatives.
Thank you, Amaya. That was quite an extensive list of worker cooperatives across various industries, and a nice mix in size as well, from small ones to really large ones, almost like a global multinational corporation. Thank you for all these insights. We now move to our final country, France, before reflecting on today's entire session from a regional and international perspective. Jean-Louis, I know you want to first begin with sort of overview of what makes a successful worker cooperative, so you can start from there.
Okay, thank you. Before giving some example about some co-ops, I wanted to give three main ideas on which we can explain, at least partially, the success of worker co-ops in France. So the first thing is something which started from the worker co-op sector and then expanded to the global French cooperative sector, which is cooperative auditing. And so there I put on the chat a link to what is said on the worker co-op side on the auditing. At the beginning, at the end of the 19th century, auditing was strictly accounting auditing, how to improve the ability of workers to understand what does that mean to make accountings. And then it shifted slowly to good management. And then it turned to be a good co-op. And that's where things changes. And that's why when I was the chair of co-operatives, which is a French global federation for all co-ops, we decided to take over from the worker co-ops this cooperative auditing into a global system for every co-op. So in a worker co-op, every year you have from an external auditor provided by the Workers' Co-op Federation, going through the process the co-op is working, just to see the way they match, okay, with the cooperative principles, how they match with the global matters such as environment and so on. So cooperative auditing is something which we believe in France is something very instructive and useful. And now even all the global social economy sector is wondering, would they expand to all the type of structures being social enterprise to do this auditing? Second thing is a financial sector. I won't expand a lot on that, but the first tool was creating a co-op, Crédit Coopératif, 140 years ago, and 130 years ago. And of course, we created different type of tools. And now we have some investment funds created for that. For example, I would put on the chat the last example I can give you. It's COP Venture, which is for new startup, how to start as a co-op. So that's the way. We also created other tools, which is an investment fund for outsiders, investors, to be investing in co-ops, not only worker co-ops, but in all types of co-ops. So there in the links, you have those things. So that's important. And the last but not the least, it's of course to have an attractive policy. And I believe this is very important, that the national federation, should it be workers federations or global federation, would help to better know about co-ops. So on communication, it's important. There I put a link on the website on how we spread out messages and so on. So that's just to give you, it's not everything, but just to give you how we try to expand the idea that worker co-ops is a real future, for not only for the worker co-ops, but for everyone. And of course, I could add lobbying with the legislator and so on, as it happened in Japan. And that's very important. And I can tell you now, the case for cops is well known in France. Just to give you in 3 different illustration of worker co-ops or participative co-ops, which might be interesting, just to show the diversity we could give. The first one is the biggest worker co-ops we have in France is Group App, which was created almost 50 years ago, and you can go on their site. They were issuing, well, bonds for a lunch for the workers, not only for the worker co-ops itself, but in any way when the enterprise do not provide a canteen where people could go eating at lunchtime. So you could, the company would give you a voucher that you can use, and this voucher is issued by Group A. That's one example. It's a very successful one. The second one I wanted to give as a very different example is Starting Blocks. Starting Blocks, and there it is, the links, is a new SIC that is a multi-stakeholder co-op created for the IT sector, trying to help people all around the world to connect together. And so it's very, very interesting the way they can help people to connect in an international world. And last, an interesting one, I wanted to show you something which is something different, but in example is, there it is. It's the Chamber Orchestra of Toulouse. The Chamber Orchestra of Toulouse is a co-op. And that's interesting because it shows that in culture, workers can play a role. And they are so innovative that they have a patent. They created for the archer a special type of things to build up violins but so they have a patent belonging to the co-op. So I could give hundreds of examples, and it's a very vivid sector. So I believe by what OECD is doing, sharing examples, it could give ideas, and it has to be adapted to different things. So that's why I believe, but I will tackle that later on, it's important we intercooperate in between co-ops. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I must say it was quite nice for you to put us back into thinking from a wider lens of what defines how a worker cooperative could be successful. Everything that you touched upon, gets at transparency, accountability, capacity building, and a culture of innovation, most importantly. This helps us nicely to sort of take a step back and reflect and discuss all of today's conversation from a broader regional and international perspective. And Diana, this is where I'd love you to join us. Considering your role in leading an international membership body of national and regional cooperative federations that promote worker cooperatives, among many others, my first question to you is, what are some common challenges or trends you'd notice that face the worker cooperatives at an international level?
Thanks a lot, Jesus, first of all, for inviting us today and for putting this accent on worker cooperatives in this webinar. I'll try not to repeat what the others said, but I have to say it's hard because already many interesting and important elements were shared by the other speakers. Just in 2 words, we as CICOPA, we have members in 36 countries worldwide, all continents included. This is important as well to underline that we found the worker cooperatives all around the world. I'll come back to that later. They take some different shapes, but it's important to underline. And according to our estimation in CICOPA network, there are more or less 4 million people working in worker cooperatives, although we estimate that there are worldwide more or less 20 million people working directly or through worker cooperatives. Obviously, not all of them are affiliated to CCOPA. So I said before, I mean, worker cooperatives can be found all around the world. Of course, they take some different shapes according to the context, the traditions of the history, the tradition of the cooperative movement, the context, etc. And they are mainly either worker cooperatives where the employees are a member of the cooperative, or self-employed producers. So those are the two different types we can find. But of course, all of them have in common this worker ownership, very unique labor relation where a worker is at the same time the owner of the cooperative. So now to answer direct to your question, some common features we can identify, and you will see many of those were already expressed by the speakers before. The first, longevity, very specific, long-term objective, long-term mission, long-term dimension, and that indeed has a great impact on the resilience. It was also underlined by some speakers before, and we see that especially in crisis time. We have seen over the last years where we had some major economic crises that worker cooperatives are more resilient compared to conventional enterprises. Equality, we also have a higher proportion of underrepresented groups, such as women or youth, in managing positions compared to conventional enterprises, as well as a smaller pay gap between lower and higher wages. This is also, I think, important to underline. Inclusivity, we see that there's a very particular attention to vulnerable groups and workers, being that people with disabilities or workers from informal workers. There are many great examples of cooperatives, worker cooperatives who come here to help those workers to exit and get into the formal activities. The quality of work, we also have some testimonies that shows that being a worker member and more that being employed working in a worker cooperative increase the quality of the work. You have better access to social protection, higher work satisfaction, better work-life balance, training, investment in training, upskilling and reskilling of workers. And last but not least, and I come back to that later, the intercooperation effect. We see that it's very common to worker cooperatives to create federations, networks of worker cooperatives that then in turn has a very important role to sustain them, support them, and we'll see that later on. What is also important to underline that all of what I'm saying comes from feedback we receive from members, but indeed we are lacking some real data showing in numbers what I'm saying. And I also would like here to underline that very often cooperatives, and more specifically worker cooperatives, are invisible from official statistic data. So this is also a call from our side to support and encourage member states' government to include cooperatives, legal form, and worker cooperatives in their statistic data. One of the challenges we see that worker cooperatives have been facing since their creation is to adapt to new labor trends, practices, evolution of world of work, societal changes. We know that work has changed a lot since we talked about the first worker cooperatives that appeared 200 years ago almost. But at the same time, there's still some challenges that are common for workers. Just to give you some examples. Jean-Louis Boncel mentioned that before, the question of workers' buyout. So this is a very interesting example. I would like to talk about how worker cooperatives are tackling some very specific issue that started in Italy, in Europe, in the 80s, when Italy faced a big industrial crisis, and when workers started to get engaged in saving the enterprise that were closing down, that were facing bankruptcy and liquidation. And through this process, workers would buy out the enterprise and establish a worker cooperative. This phenomenon has since then never stopped. We've seen that in Argentina in 2000, when there was also a big industrial crisis, an economic crisis there, and with the phenomenon of empresas recuperadas, and I mean it's today taking new shapes. So worker buyout are still very topical in many countries, either for saving enterprises facing crisis situation, or as it was mentioned before, the workers buying out, we'll say, healthy enterprises, usually small family-owned businesses, but where the heir is going to retire and there is no successor. And this is also a new and growing phenomenon of workers buying out and establishing worker cooperatives. So this is a very complex phenomenon, but still with a huge potential, especially with the aging population that we're facing right now globally, and that it's something that also needs a specific attention from governments and international organizations to see how workers' buyouts could be better supported worldwide. Another phenomenon to which worker cooperatives are also reacting, I mean, since their creation, is the workers' isolation. And here I'm talking more about individual producers or self-employed who get together to mutualize their risks, costs, etc., and through a worker cooperative. I mean, artisan cooperatives are not new. They are, of course, they appeared together at the same time as one of the first worker cooperatives as well. But today we see an increasing trend of cooperatives established among freelancers, self-employed, so those new type of non-standard workers who are seeking the same security and autonomy and flexibility, mutualization through the worker cooperative. And here as well to be underlined some new sectors, as I said before, like the digital sector or platform economy, where we see as well worker cooperatives being a great potential for isolated workers to mutualize the risks and also and services. So just here to underline what is really amazing, I think, with worker cooperatives is that we have a almost 200 years old formula that still works, and that shows that it's very modern and innovative and capable to adapt to emerging and new needs that workers are facing. So I think this is really something that needs to be underlined, that this 200 years model didn't change that much from when it was established, but it still shows its adaptability to the new contexts and capacity to answer to workers' needs. Maybe I will end with another element that I think needs to be underlined, is the factors that are needed for worker cooperatives development, and this is also based on the observation at national level. Again, here we need to underline that the traditions vary and practices vary. We have countries, for example, like we've seen with Japan, where worker cooperatives existed before the law on worker cooperatives appeared. And by the way, I here also would like to underline, I think we also have our member from Japan, the Japanese Worker Coop Federation, who was attending the webinar, how the role of the federation was important in asking and contributing to this Japanese law on worker cooperatives as well. And we also have situations when law came and also served as a launch ramp for worker cooperatives to expand. In a nutshell, I would say we need an interaction of three elements for worker cooperatives to thrive and to develop. Adequate legal frameworks, that was said before, for worker cooperatives, but also for worker ownership. Very important to recognize this very specific labor relation in legislation. Favorable policies, that was said before as well. Here as well, important to underline, we need at national level very specific policies that tackle, that really support worker cooperatives, but we also need to mainstream worker cooperatives in other policies. Let's remind that we are not living in a separate island. Many of the worker cooperatives are SMEs. So when also governments adopt policies, funds, instruments to support SMEs, they need to be sure that worker cooperatives are also eligible there. The same, for example, if you have policies to support youth entrepreneurship, you should also make sure, for example, that the worker cooperative model is one of the models that is here eligible, that is promoted, etc. And we know we have a big concern of this very specific entrepreneurship model, not known enough, not known by young people, not known by entrepreneurs, etc. And the third, still about favorable policies, specific policies for worker cooperatives, mainstreaming, but as well incentives. It was said before, incentives through taxation, incentives for workers for starting capital, etc. And the third, but one of the most important, maybe as well, I would like, it maybe was not enough underlined here, I'm glad to do it here, is the consolidation of worker cooperatives into cooperative federations, unions, and networks. And this element is super important because we see that in the countries where worker cooperatives are well developed and are important in numbers, in the same countries, you will find well-established and organized worker co-op federation. And what is the role of those worker cooperative federations? That is that in those countries, usually by law, worker cooperatives are obliged to give a percentage of the surplus to the mutualistic funds and instruments that are managed by worker cooperative federations. And they play a crucial role, first, in providing advisory and consultancy to new cooperatives, or also the existing ones for the growing and scaling up needs. Two, they provide very specific financial instruments that are well fitted for worker cooperatives. And we know that, and we don't have time to address it, that access to financing is a huge challenge for cooperatives. They organize training for workers and worker members. And of course, they represent worker cooperatives toward the government, providing advocacy, representation, etc. So I really would like to underline that this same solidarity and cooperation you will find in one single worker cooperative among workers, you'll find the same organization in federations and unions, the same principle of solidarity, trust, where cooperatives are there to support each other. And I think this is one of the crucial also elements to explain worker cooperative success and development. I'll stop here. I have many other things to say, but I know we are limited by time. Yeah. And I'll also be glad to, if needed, to answer to some questions.
Diana, thank you so much for that comprehensive presentation and speech about this landscape. On that note, in the interest of time, I want to quickly, though abruptly, shift into our last few minutes for Q&A for our audience members here. And on that note, one question that I see is from John Whitman. Are there any formal studies of personality types or psychological traits that are more successful in worker co-ops? I mean, regardless of study types, I think some of our panelists could attest to what types of personality traits would be conducive for operating and conducting in a worker cooperative setting. Any thoughts about this, panelists? Please feel free to jump in.
I suppose to think about startups, one of the things we find is unconventional entrepreneurs are more likely to be successful in worker co-ops. So what I mean by that is very high ego, high talent, Mark Zuckerberg type people set up investor-owned businesses. The sorts of people who set up worker co-ops are the sorts of people who want to work with other people, maybe won't have the capability or the confidence to set up a business on their own. And so I think that's a really useful tool to have in the toolbox for business advisors. How do you help people who could never set up a business on their own set up a business? So that's a different take.
And Jean-Louis, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I believe there is no gene, no natural gene to be a cop or not to be a cop. Something which is important, of course, is first education, So it's important for the cooperative sector to expand on communication and giving example, and of course, trying to fill in the gap. That's the difference with some big multinational in between talking and doing. I believe the good things we can show that what we've done this morning is to good example, practical example, not only good talks, because that's, I believe, what the young people don't bear. It's good in talking, not so good in doing. So we have to be good in talking and doing.
Thank you for that. Now I want to move into we have two questions that are more sector specific. One is about public health. Are there any worker cooperatives, or how can they in healthcare contribute to broader public health care goals, such as preventive care and community health initiatives? And one is about formerly incarcerated people. Are there any case studies on co-ops that engage in such marginalized people or other types? Diana, you have your hand raised up. You could answer to either the previous question or these ones too, but please chime in.
So to the second question, if you allow me,
Sure.
So yeah, indeed. I mean, cooperatives in the care sector, in providing services to the community, social services community, this is an important phenomenon. It's not new. I mean, although it's, again, very not equally spread across the countries. Again, Italy is a pioneer here, from starting in the 70s with the first social cooperatives, providing elderly care, care for people with disabilities. And we see that this is one of the most increasing sector for social cooperatives today, since we all know that the challenge of care is huge for many governments. First, because of the decrease of public investment and organization of public care and social services by the state in many countries. It's more and more privatized sector, right? And the second one, because of the aging population and increasing demand for home-based care. So we see, again, I mean, like in other sectors, we see that cooperatives very often here come as also as a reaction, community-based reaction to a deficit of a service that is not offered by the state. And they come with their own formula, and it works quite successfully. What is important here to underline, again, is that the role and cooperation between public authority and cooperatives is crucial here. It's not just on the shoulders of cooperatives to solve this huge issue of care or public service. They cannot hold them alone, right, on their shoulders. This is also very sensitive, very in sectors that need, of course, a good cooperation. We see many examples of cooperatives providing this type of services through public procurement. So this is one way, but we are also calling for something that goes beyond just the public procurement phenomenon. We also call for co-designing. It's important for local authorities, public authorities to associate cooperatives in co-designing the service together, because as cooperatives are community-owned organizations, they also know, they're also able to say what the community needs, which kind of service the community needs. So it's very important that we see this recognition and cooperation between public authorities and cooperatives for the provision of care services. And my colleague Nicolette shared in the chat a report that our European organization, SECOP, has published on care cooperatives. So I really invite all those who are interested in the topic to read it.
Thank you, Diana. Mizuno-san, do you want to join in to have a word?
はい。簡潔に、日本でも労働者協同組合法ができる前から、やっぱりその福祉の世界、介護とか、子育て支援、そういったところで労働者協同組合のような働き方がされています。で、法律ができた後であっても、やっぱりその介護ですとか、ケアの分野で労働者協同組合が多く出てきておりますし、特に最近では、やはり、介護の分野でも、ケアワーカーの皆さんが集まって、ケアを担うっていうことですとか、あと最近医療の分野でも歯科医院の歯医者さんの世界でケア、予防的に歯科医療をやっていくっていう動きが出てきているということをご紹介したいと思います。
Thank you for that. And on that note, due to our timing constraints, we would have to end the agenda of the day. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for their participation in today's webinar, as well as all the insights and experiences shared by our speakers. We learned today of the many positive contributions that worker cooperatives can provide for society. And of note, as our Deputy Secretary General has mentioned in his welcoming remarks, there is still a more important need to deepen our evidence and understanding through research, through these dialogues, to explore the role worker cooperatives can play in tackling some of the problems that we face as an international community and in driving better outcomes for a particular economy or society. As the moderator of today's event, I hope today was only the beginning of many more initiatives and attempts in doing exactly this. Thank you once again to everybody for joining in. And for our friends in Japan, have a great evening. And for our friends in Europe and in other parts of the world, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.